The 2:15 a.m. commuter train out of the city was supposed to be completely empty. But when a shattered, sobbing ER nurse collapsed onto the shoulder of a yawled, centuries-old immortal, destiny abruptly rewrote the rules. He was the city's unseen predator. She was just trying to survive. And for her, he deliberately missed his stop. The sliding doors of the hospital lobby hissed shut behind Chloe, cutting off the sharp, sterile scent of bleach and the relentless beeping of heart monitors. Outside, the Seattle rain was a relentless, freezing sheet, but Chloe barely felt the chill soaking through her thin wool coat. She felt nothing but a hollow, crushing numbness. It had been the worst 14-hour shift of her entire career at St. Jude's Medical Center. At 9 p.m., she had lost Toby. He was only 7 years old, a bright-eyed boy with a fondness for comic books who had come in with what they thought was a routine appendix rupture. The sudden catastrophic cardiac arrest on the operating table had blindsided the entire surgical team. Dr. Gregory Finch, the lead surgeon, had thrown his gloves against the wall in a rare display of fury, but it was Chloe who had to pack up Toby's belongings. It was Chloe who had to hand the small, worn Spider-Man action figure to a mother whose screams would haunt her nightmares for the rest of her life. To make the nightmare complete, she had checked her phone in the locker room, only to find a cold, clinical text from Ryan, her fiancé of 3 years. "I can't do this anymore, Chloe. I packed my things. Leave the ring on the counter." No explanation. No face-to-face conversation. Just a digital dismissal. Dragging her feet, Chloe descended the concrete stairs into the subterranean depths of the transit center. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting a sickly yellow pallor over the damp platform. The 2:15 a.m. train was the last outbound line to the northern suburbs. Usually, the carriages were desolate metal tubes rolling through the dark, populated only by ghosts and exhaustion. When the train groaned to a halt, Chloe stepped into the third carriage. It was empty, save for a single passenger sitting near the rear doors. Alistair sat with the perfect, unnatural stillness of a predator waiting in the brush. To the untrained human eye, he looked like a wealthy, exhausted hedge fund manager heading home after an unforgiving day on the market. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that clung perfectly to his broad shoulders, a crisp midnight blue shirt unbuttoned at the collar, and an expensive leather briefcase resting at his feet. His dark hair was meticulously swept back, framing a face composed of sharp, aristocratic angles. His jaw was a hard line of tension, his pale skin stark against the dimly lit carriage. But Alistair was no stockbroker. He was the reigning sovereign of the Pacific Northwest's underground faction, a creature who had not seen the sun since the winter of 1842. He rode the late-night trains not out of necessity, but as a grounding exercise. It was a way to observe the human cattle, to study their fragile, fleeting little lives, and to remind himself why he ruled them from the shadows. Chloe didn't notice him, or rather, she didn't care. The world had shattered around her, and the presence of a stranger was entirely irrelevant. She dropped heavily into the seat directly across the aisle and 1 row ahead of him. The train lurched forward, the rhythmic clack, clack, clack of the wheels echoing in the empty cabin. For the first 10 minutes, Chloe stared blankly at her reflection in the dark, rain-streaked window. She looked like a ghost. Her blonde hair was a messy knot, dark purple bags dragged under her swollen eyes, and her pale blue scrubs were stained with a tiny speck of Toby's blood near the collar. Then the dam broke. It didn't happen with a dramatic wail. It started as a tiny, pathetic hitch in her breathing. She brought a trembling hand to her mouth, trying desperately to stifle the sound, but the grief was a physical weight crushing her chest. A tear slipped down her cheek, cutting a clean path through her exhaustion. Then another. Soon her slender shoulders were shaking violently as silent, agonizing sobs tore through her body. She buried her face in her hands, curling inward as if trying to fold herself out of existence. From his seat behind her, Alistair watched. His heightened senses were immediately assaulted. He could hear the frantic, erratic thumping of her heart, a tiny, fragile bird trapped in a cage of ribs. He could smell the sharp, metallic tang of the dried blood on her collar, mixing with the heavy, saline scent of her tears. To a vampire, human sorrow was usually a repulsive smell, bitter, sour, and weak. But this was different. There was a raw, devastating purity to her grief that commanded the air in the cabin. The train took a sharp curve. Chloe, blinded by her tears and completely unmoored by exhaustion, swayed heavily in her seat. The fatigue of a 14-hour shift, combined with the catastrophic emotional crash, finally shut her brain down. She slumped sideways, her head tipped, missing the cold glass of the window, and instead, as the train jolted again, she slid down the slick plastic seating. Alistair, who had casually shifted into the aisle seat to observe her, suddenly found the weeping human collapsing directly into his space. Chloe's head landed softly against Alistair's shoulder. Instinctively, the vampire stiffened, his muscles locked like carved marble. For a fraction of a second, his fangs elongated, pressing against his lower lip, a reflex triggered by the sudden, intimate proximity of a beating jugular vein. The heavy scent of her lavender shampoo and the warm, rhythmic pulse of the blood in her neck hit his senses like a physical blow. He looked down. She was completely out, her breathing shuddering as sleep overtook her weeping. One of her small, cold hands rested lightly against the fine wool of his jacket lapel. Alistair remained perfectly still. He was a king, a monster who commanded legions of killers. He could snap her neck with a flick of his wrist. He should shove her away in disgust. Instead, a strange, long-forgotten sensation bloomed in the dead center of his chest. He slowly turned his head, letting his cheek rest a millimeter above her messy hair, and listened to the tragic, beautiful rhythm of her broken heart. For the next 20 minutes, the train rattled through the lightless industrial corridors of the city's outer rim. Alistair sat paralyzed by an alien hesitation. He did not breathe. He had no need to. But he found himself perfectly mimicking the rise and fall of Chloe's chest, creating a steady, rhythmic cradle for the sleeping girl. He glanced down at the plastic ID badge clipped to her scrubs. Chloe Evans, registered nurse. The mechanical voice overhead crackled to life, breaking the hypnotic trance. Next stop, Ashwood Industrial Park. Doors opening on the right. Ashwood was his territory. Waiting on that rain-slicked platform would be his brutal second-in-command, a towering vampire named Dominic, alongside a heavily armored town car, ready to escort the king back to his estate. Alistair's empire required his presence. A dispute over feeding territories with a rogue faction from Portland was escalating, and blood was expected to be spilled tonight in the warehouse district. The train slowed, the brakes screeching against the wet steel tracks. Through the smeared window, Alistair saw the bleak yellow lights of the Ashwood platform. He saw the dark silhouette of Dominic standing under an umbrella, flanked by 2 bodyguards, their eyes scanning the carriages as the train rolled to a stop. All Alistair had to do was stand up. He just had to shrug the exhausted, fragile human off his shoulder, step through the doors, and return to his kingdom of shadows and violence. Chloe shifted in her sleep. A tiny, pathetic whimper escaped her lips, and she subconsciously burrowed her face deeper into the crook of his neck, seeking the solid, grounding comfort of his presence. Her breath was warm against his icy skin. Alistair looked out the window at his waiting lieutenants. Then he looked down at the tear-stained face of the nurse. The doors hissed open. A blast of freezing, damp air swept into the cabin. Alistair did not move. He raised a hand, pressing a single, authoritative finger against the glass, making direct eye contact with Dominic on the platform. The lieutenant's eyes widened in confusion, taking in the sight of his merciless king, serving as a pillow for a mortal woman. Alistair gave a microscopic shake of his head. "Stand down." The warning chime beeped. The doors hissed shut. The train lurched forward again, leaving the vampire elite standing in the rain. Alistair had just abandoned his throne for the night, and he didn't entirely understand why. He only knew that moving this broken creature felt like an unforgivable sin. The train continued its relentless push northward, diving deep into the desolate, heavily forested edge of the county. Another 45 minutes passed. The carriage grew steadily colder, but Alistair quietly commanded his own dead circulatory system to push residual heat to the surface of his skin, ensuring the shivering human remained warm. Finally, the train shuddered with an aggressive jolt, the brakes whining in a high-pitched protest. "End of the line. Black Creek Terminus. All passengers must disembark. Train is out of service." The harsh change in pitch and the violent rocking of the carriage snapped Chloe awake. She gasped, her blue eyes snapping open in pure panic. For a disorienting second, she didn't know where she was. The lights were blinding. The seat was hard. And then she realized she was pressed flush against the chest of a strange man. Chloe scrambled backward, practically tripping over her own feet as she slammed into the opposite window. "Oh my God!" she gasped, her hands flying to her mouth, her cheeks flushed violently with a deep, humiliated crimson. "I am so sorry. I fell asleep. I didn't mean to. I'm so sorry." Alistair slowly turned to face her. His expression was an unreadable mask of calm sophistication. He casually brushed a non-existent wrinkle from his jacket. "It is quite all right, Miss Evans," he said, his voice a rich, dark velvet that seemed to vibrate in the cold air. Chloe blinked, her panic momentarily stalling at the sound of his voice. It was impossibly smooth, ancient, and commanding. Then her brain caught up. "How do you know my name?" He gestured gracefully with a pale hand toward her chest. "Your badge." She looked down, her face burning hotter. "Right. God, I must have drooled on your suit. I'm so embarrassed. What stop is this?" She turned to look out the window. Instead of the familiar, brightly lit platform of her suburban neighborhood, she saw a rusted, chain-link fence and a dense wall of black pine trees. A single, flickering streetlight illuminated a cracked concrete platform. "Black Creek Terminus," Alistair supplied calmly, standing up. He towered over her, his presence suddenly filling the small cabin, suffocating and vast. "The end of the line." "No," Chloe whispered, her heart plummeting into her stomach. She checked her phone. Dead. The battery had drained completely. No. My stop was an hour ago. There aren't any connecting buses out here at this time. It's the middle of nowhere." "Indeed it is," Alistair said, stepping smoothly past her toward the open doors. He paused, looking back over his shoulder. His dark eyes caught the dim light, flashing with a strange, predatory luminescence. "The transit guards will lock this train in exactly 3 minutes. Unless you wish to sleep in the rail yard, I suggest you follow me." Chloe hesitated. Every survival instinct she possessed screamed at her not to follow a mysterious, terrifyingly beautiful stranger into the dead of night. But the lights inside the carriage suddenly clicked off, plunging them into darkness. Swallowing her fear, she grabbed her tote bag and hurried out into the freezing rain. The Black Creek station was little more than a slab of concrete, surrounded by an empty, sprawling gravel parking lot. The rain was torrential now. Chloe shivered violently, hugging herself as she walked a few paces behind the tall man in the suit. "I can call a cab from the payphone if there is one," Chloe stuttered over the roar of the downpour. Before Alistair could answer, a harsh, grating voice echoed from the shadows of a defunct ticket booth. "Well, well, look what the late train dragged in." Chloe froze. 3 men stepped out from the darkness, blocking their path to the street. They reeked of cheap liquor, stale tobacco, and violence. The man in the middle, heavily tattooed with a thick crowbar, resting casually against his shoulder, sneered at Chloe. "Bit lost, sweetheart," he taunted, his eyes raking over her soaked scrubs. "You and the suit want to empty your pockets? Or maybe we just take the girl and the suit can walk." Chloe's breath hitched in her throat. She stepped backward, a primal terror taking over. But Alistair did not retreat. He didn't even flinch. He slowly set his expensive leather briefcase down on the wet gravel. When he looked up at the 3 men, the wealthy businessman was gone. In his place stood something ancient, terrifying, and infinitely dangerous. "You have exactly 3 seconds, Alistair said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, inhuman register that seemed to echo from the very ground beneath them, to return to whatever hole you crawled out of. The heavily tattooed man with the crowbar barked out a harsh, gravelly laugh, completely oblivious to the sudden, suffocating drop in temperature. 3 seconds. Listen to this arrogant piece of trash. I'm going to cave your skull in and take the Rolex right off your twitching wrist. He lunged forward, raising the heavy iron bar with a savage, 2-handed grip. Chloe screamed, squeezing her eyes shut, bracing for the sickening sound of a shattering skull. But the sound that echoed across the desolate Black Creek platform was the sharp, metallic screech of bending iron. Chloe opened her eyes, gasping in disbelief. Alistair had not stepped back. He had not dodged. He simply stood there, his left hand raised, his pale fingers wrapped effortlessly around the thick, descending crowbar. The attacker's eyes bulged in absolute shock as he strained against Alistair's grip. The vampire's face remained completely impassive. Slowly, deliberately, Alistair squeezed his hand. The solid iron groaned and warped under his fingers like cheap aluminum foil. With a casual flick of his wrist, Alistair tore the weapon from the man's hands and drove the palm of his other hand into the center of the attacker's chest. The impact sounded like a car crash. The large man was launched backward through the torrential rain, flying a full 20 feet before slamming into the rusted ticket booth. He crumpled to the wet concrete, utterly unconscious. The remaining 2 thugs froze, their bravado evaporating into pure, unadulterated terror. For a second, the only sound was the relentless drumming of the Seattle rain. Then panic set in. The man on the left fumbled frantically in his coat pocket, pulling out a stolen Glock 19. His hands shook violently as he racked the slide. "Alistair, look out!" Chloe screamed, her voice tearing through her raw throat. The gunshot rang out, a deafening crack that echoed off the dark pine trees. But the bullet never reached its target. Alistair moved with a speed that shattered Chloe's comprehension of physics. He was suddenly just there, standing directly in front of the gunman. Before the thug could pull the trigger a second time, Alistair clamped his hand over the barrel of the gun and crushed it inward, rendering the weapon entirely useless. A swift, brutal strike to the man's temple sent him collapsing into the gravel. The third man didn't wait. He turned and bolted into the dark woods, sprinting for his life. Silence descended upon the rail yard once more. Alistair slowly turned around, his eyes locking onto Chloe. The predatory glow in his dark irises was fading, returning to the calm, wealthy facade of a mortal businessman. He picked up his leather briefcase from the puddle at his feet. "Are you injured, Miss Evans?" Chloe was trembling so hard her teeth chattered. She stared at him, her medical training warring violently with the impossible reality she had just witnessed. "What are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. Before Alistair could answer, a pair of blinding LED headlights swept across the cracked parking lot. A sleek, armored black Maybach tore through the gravel, coming to an aggressive halt just inches from the platform. The heavy doors swung open, and Dominic, the towering lieutenant from the Ashwood station, stepped out, rain instantly slicking his dark tactical gear. "Sir," Dominic said, his voice completely devoid of surprise as he took in the unconscious bodies. "The perimeter is compromised. The Portland faction sent scouts. They've been tracking the train since you missed the rendezvous." Dominic's sharp eyes suddenly snapped toward Chloe. His nostrils flared, picking up a scent that made his jaw lock. "She's bleeding." Chloe looked down in confusion. The adrenaline had masked the pain entirely, but now a sharp, stinging sensation burned along her right bicep. The bullet had missed Alistair, but the ricochet off the pavement had grazed her arm, tearing through her scrub top. A slow, steady stream of dark crimson was soaking into the blue fabric. Alistair's expression darkened. The scent of her fresh blood hit the open air, a heavy, intoxicating aroma that immediately triggered the predatory instincts of both vampires. Dominic took a half-step forward, his fangs inadvertently dropping. "Do not take another step, Dominic," Alistair growled, his voice suddenly vibrating with a terrifying, absolute authority that forced the lieutenant to immediately avert his eyes and step back in submission. Alistair removed his expensive wool suit jacket and draped it over Chloe's shivering shoulders, deliberately covering the wound to mask the scent. "Get in the car," he commanded softly, his hands resting momentarily on her shoulders. "I need to go home," Chloe protested weakly, her knees threatening to buckle. "I live on Lexington Avenue. Please, just call me a cab." "The men who are hunting me have just seen you in my company," Alistair stated, his tone devoid of any negotiation. "If you go to Lexington Avenue tonight, you will be dead before sunrise. Get in the car, Chloe." The sheer gravity of his words, combined with the impossible strength she had just witnessed, left her with no choice. She slid into the plush leather interior of the Maybach. Alistair slid in beside her, and the heavy door slammed shut, sealing them inside a soundproof, armored vault. As Dominic pushed the massive engine to its limits, speeding away from the rail yard, Chloe pressed her hand against her bleeding arm. She looked at the man beside her. He was an apex predator, a creature out of nightmares, yet the wool coat he had wrapped around her was radiating a comforting, deliberate warmth. "Who is hunting you?" Chloe asked quietly, the shock finally giving way to a desperate need for answers. Alistair stared out the tinted window at the blurring city lights. "Monsters, Miss Evans. Monsters who have just discovered my only vulnerability." He slowly turned his head to look at her, his dark eyes tracing the delicate lines of her exhausted face. "You." The Maybach bypassed the city centre entirely, crossing the floating bridge toward the secluded, hyper-wealthy enclave of Mercer Island. They drove through a pair of massive wrought iron gates, pulling up to a sprawling Gothic Revival stone manor hidden behind acres of dense, ancient evergreens. Inside, the estate was a masterful blend of centuries-old antiques and modern security. Chloe was led to a massive fire-lit study that smelled of old paper, leather, and cedar. A discreet, elderly housekeeper had already provided a first aid kit and a fresh, oversized cashmere sweater. Chloe sat on the edge of a Chesterfield sofa, meticulously cleaning and bandaging the graze on her arm with the practiced efficiency of an ER nurse. The bleeding had stopped, but her mind was spinning entirely out of control. The heavy mahogany doors opened, and Alistair walked in. He had discarded his ruined shirt, now wearing a simple black Henley that clung to the heavily muscled planes of his chest. He held a thick manila folder in his hands. "Your wound is superficial, but I apologize for the trauma of this evening," Alistair said, taking a seat in the leather armchair opposite her. He placed the folder on the glass coffee table between them. "You bent a solid iron crowbar," Chloe said, her voice eerily calm as she taped the gauze down. "You moved faster than a bullet, and your friend at the station, he had fangs. I saw them." She looked up, her blue eyes locking onto his. "I deal in science, Alistair. I fix broken bodies. Tell me what you are." "I am a vampire," Alistair answered smoothly, without a trace of hesitation or irony. "I was born in London in 1812, and I have governed the immortal population of the Pacific Northwest for the last 80 years. Chloe stopped breathing. Hearing the words spoken out loud in a well-lit, civilized room felt like a fever dream. But the memories of the train, the rail yard, and the cold perfection of his face left no room for denial. "Why am I here?" she asked, her voice finally trembling. "Why didn't you just let me get off the train at my stop?" Alistair leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Because when you fell asleep on my shoulder, I realized something. You work at St. Jude's Medical Center." He tapped the manila folder. "Open it." Chloe hesitantly reached forward and flipped open the cover. Inside were dozens of surveillance photographs, banking records, and encrypted emails. She gasped. The first photo was of her boss, Dr. Gregory Finch, handing a heavy, insulated cooler to a man she didn't recognize in the hospital's underground loading dock. "The rogue faction from Portland has been attempting to stage a coup against my territory," Alistair explained, his voice cold and analytical. "To sustain an army, they need a massive, untraceable supply of human blood. They found a willing mortal partner in Dr. Finch. He has been systematically writing off hundreds of units of donor blood as spoiled or contaminated, funneling it out of St. Jude's directly to my enemies." Chloe felt sick. "Finch, he's a prominent surgeon. He makes millions. Why would he risk everything for this?" "Because he has a gambling debt that the hospital board knows nothing about," Alistair said. "But Dr. Finch is just the supplier. He needed an accountant to clean the massive amounts of dark money the Portland faction is paying him. Someone who could quietly alter the hospital's logistics budget without raising any red flags." Alistair reached over and flipped to the second page of the dossier. Chloe's heart stopped. Staring back at her was a photograph of Ryan, her fiancé, the man who had broken her heart via a text message just hours ago. "Ryan," she whispered, the color draining entirely from her face. "No, Ryan is a mid-level financial auditor. He just left me tonight. He packed up his apartment and ran. He ran because my lieutenant, Dominic, uncovered his operation this morning," Alistair stated gently. "Ryan knew the network was collapsing. He knew we were coming for him. He abandoned you to save his own life, severing ties so you wouldn't be implicated when the cartel fell." The sheer magnitude of the betrayal hit Chloe like a physical blow. The missing blood units, the strange, unexplained budget cuts at St. Jude's that had caused equipment shortages that had indirectly led to the deaths of patients like little Toby. Ryan and Dr. Finch were trading human lives to feed monsters. A fresh wave of tears welled in Chloe's eyes, but this time It wasn't just grief. It was an intense, white-hot fury. Alistair stood up and walked over to her, kneeling slowly on the Persian rug until he was eye-level with her. He reached out, his cool, perfectly smooth thumb gently wiping a tear from her cheek. "When you wept on that train," Alistair murmured, his voice softening into a devastatingly tender register, "I felt the purity of your despair. I intended to walk away and let the mortals handle their own corruption. But then you rested your head against me. You trusted me in your sleep." He took her bandaged hand in his grip grounding and unbreakable. "The men who attacked us tonight were sent by the Portland faction. They know Ryan was engaged to you. They will assume you know about the money, and they will try to silence you. You cannot return to your old life, Chloe." "Then what do I do?" she asked, staring into the ancient, fathomless dark of his eyes. "You stay with me," Alistair vowed, the promise echoing like an unbreakable blood oath in the quiet room. "I am the apex predator of this city. Let them come for you. Let Dr. Finch and the Portland rogues bring their entire army to my gates. I will tear them apart piece by piece, and I will ensure you never have to shed another tear." Chloe looked at the immortal king kneeling before her. The life she knew was dead. Her hospital was corrupted, her fiancé was a criminal, and the world was filled with monsters. But as she looked at Alistair, she realized that sometimes the only way to survive the darkness is to let the deadliest monster in the room become your shield. She tightened her grip on his hand. "Okay," she whispered. "Take them down." Did this dark, rain-swept romance capture your heart? The story of Alistair and Chloe proves that sometimes the wrong stop leads to exactly the right destination. If you want to hear more thrilling, supernatural love stories and dramatic vampire mysteries, hit that like button right now. Don't forget to share this video with your fellow romance lovers and subscribe to our channel so you never miss a twist in the shadows. See you in the next tale.